The exploration of Ollantay, the Kifu, and 18th century Neo-Incan politics. This article is by Galen Brokaw, and my name is Anthony Palmer. To introduce, the first manuscript of Apu Ollantay was discovered in the 19th century. It has This article debates over the indigenous versus the colonial origin. So the pre-colonial setting is sort of this indigenous argument, but the colonial origin follows from this Spanish dramatical convention that sort of it grows from. There's a fundamental impasse, though, due to a lack of information that comes up with reasonable answers. So any answer that is produced that tries to give a definitive yes or no, or like one side or the other, it can easily have its theory poked through with other information or just by saying you don't have enough information to make that assertion. There's two main ideas. There's this critical impasse that comes from the need to assign Ollantay a fixed identity and the tendency to neglect the implications of transcultural processes in the colonial period. So to simplify that word smoothie is that look at Apu Ollantay as a work that can help analyze the colonial period of Peru, specifically the 18th century. It's a very unique time period we're going to talk about. Were the records, the other main idea is where are the records to support either argument, pre-colonial origin or post-colonial origin? So we'll go through a couple different historians, or we'll go through one historian really, the main one. So the age of the Andean insurrection, Ollantay, this valiant general who rebels against his king for love, kind of related to Steve J. Stern, identifying that there's over 100 uprisings in a 40-year period of 1742 to 1782. So these uprisings brought with them the start of a renaissance of the Quechua language and all these dramas and potteries and unique cultural aspects, even the Kifu, like we're going to talk about. So, Quechua is this very important language to Peru, sort of the original language to a certain extent. Of course, it's changed over time, but even today, if you go to Peru, there's over, I think, 10 million Quechan language speakers in Peru. So this was an organized renewal of culture, specifically by the indigenous and Incan nobles who were trying to hold on to their cultural political power through a time when the class system was changing. Mulatto and mestizo people were growing rapidly. They had already basically come for the middle class and they were coming in strong. And so these indigenous and Incan nobles from ancient basically descendants of old ancient families took over and they were kind of like, okay, we're gonna make sure that if anything comes out of Inca, it's gonna be from us, and we're gonna, really promote this, and we're gonna throw Quechua in there. And they sort of organized this through the Renaissance and through the uprisings, and they asserted themselves and cemented themselves even to this day. Ollantay is very much representative of this time period because of the way nobles like were holding onto their power and reinforcing those class structures. If you remember, in Apu Ollantay, it's very clearly this king versus one of his best generals, but his best general is a commoner, so he can't marry his daughter. And there's sort of this class conflict that's there that's, common in other stories, but in this one, it's very relevant to this time period when, nobles look down on all of the rest of everybody. So, moving on, we've also got the Kifu to a lesser extent was a symbol of like Incan ingenuity that was comparable to other aspects, but historians like to Europeanize certain parts of that so that it seemed more civilized to older age people. One of those was Garcilaso de la Vega. Garcilaso, 1539, he was born, and the reason we're talking about him is that he was the exclusive authoritative source for the Incan Renaissance that was sort of built upon in the 18th century. He wrote Comentarios de la Vega, and they do have issues. He took a humanist approach to reconstructing the Incas because, unlike Greek, Rome, China, all these other countries, there wasn't like a written alphabetic system to go through. What he had to do was he went through regional Kifu accounts, and unfortunately, he didn't have direct access because he never learned it. He was, only he left Peru when he was 20, so all of this like research was before the age of 20 for him. Um, he hadn't learned it yet, so he would get other older people to come and, decipher all this stuff, and then he would record it down in written language. But the most important thing to our cares is that he recorded that actors were played by Incas and other nobles rather than individuals of lower status, which clashes with the Ollantay claim of a Spanish dramatical convention being followed. So, we also know that, like, if the people of the time that are of higher status do something, it might imply that there's more meaning behind this. So, as I have on this slide, it might promote the idea that these activities were a part of a greater cultural practice or ritual. Garcilaso also did not record the existence of Ollantay. He recorded a lot of stuff. He even recorded that there were four different types of plays that were common in Incan theater. There was, in of those four different types, Ollantay was not even considered in any of that type of stuff. So even if Ollantay was a pre-colonial writing, it definitely wasn't one that every single person knew. It wasn't like a universal writing among Quechua readers and writers. And Garcilaso de Vega wasn't the only one. Neither did the other earlier chroniclers who recorded indigenous cultural practices, though often those people didn't go through Kifu. They were just going from isolated village to isolated village and recording the oral traditions. Um, they didn't have any sort of analog between the Andean and European dramas. So this sort of concept that uh, Ollantay is this pre-colonial work that follows Spanish dramatic convention is not really something that should exist based off what we're reading. If we analyze that pre-Hispanic setting of Ollantay, we find it really difficult to examine these indigenous cultural concepts and traditions just because so much time has passed and so little was recorded. Kifu is the most overlooked option that has been documented with history. Kifu are these like colored knotted strings that we used to, or that the Incas used to communicate in the Andean region, for everything from censuses to who needs to pay taxes to tithes to, um, you know, who needs what. Um, there are two Kifu readings in the play, one at the beginning to inform the king of the rebellion's initial success, and then one at the end that announces Ollantay's defeat. So if we explore Kifu, Kifu is something that people knew about in the 18th and 19th centuries, but it wasn't really well known about. It was very few people knew about it. Coincidentally, the publishing of the archaeological description of Kifu was in 1846, but the first transcript of Ollantay was published in 1853. Previous chroniclers and historians hid their books away, sort of uh, going back to Garcilaso de la Vega. He wrote everything in Peru up until he was 20 years old, and once he turned 20, he moved from Peru. So all of his writings are up until he's 20 years old. Then he doesn't publish his book until he's 60 years old. So those are the kind of that's the kind of traditional historian's perspective that was popular in this sort of region, that people would hide their stuff away. They wouldn't do their stuff until they were like really ready to present their ideas. This is prevalent in like the 18th century. So most Kifu museums also were frauds, and this is sort of why, is that like a lot of the information wasn't out there to decipher whether something is a fraud or not. Very few people had held a real Kifu, and archaeologists at large did not know the difference yet. So there's reports of people like saying like, "Oh, this is what a Kifu feels like" and stuff, and they're still quoted today. But then if you and because those site everything else about those sources was credible. But if you go back and you look, you see, oh, this person never even held a real Kifu. They were holding a fraud, and then their descriptions were spread. So, in conclusion, there's a fundamental impasse on whether Ollantay is of indigenous origin or colonial origin. The Age of Andean Resurrection is an interesting time where we can use Ollantay to understand the actions of the time. Garcilaso de Vega was the premier source for that Incan Renaissance that's kind of present in the Andean insurrection period, and many of his assertions of Incan and Andean theater clash with the post-colonial opinions of Ollantay. The Kifu are also our only really linked to ancient times that we can attempt to view Ollantay through, as it is also present in Ollantay, and that's the one we have the most amount of information on. So thank you for your time.